This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare. In September 2012, a female student was gang-raped and attacked by 6 men on a bus in Delhi. She'd gone to see a film with her boyfriend and was on her way home. 3 months later, bus driver Ram Singh and 3 other men were arrested, and the victim died in hospital in Singapore. Doctors say she died of organ failure after suffering severe internal and brain injuries. The victim's mother demanded capital punishment for all 4 men, saying they should all be hanged until they're dead. On the 13th of September 2013, a judge in Delhi sentenced the 4 men convicted for their role in the gang rape and murder of the 23-year-old to death. The judge said the attack shocked the collective conscience of India, and this case certainly resonates deeply with women all over the world. But what will this death sentence do for the endemic violence against women in India and worldwide? Joining me for a discussion on the Voice of Russia here in London is writer and broadcaster Bidisha Sanita Ambast from Amnesty International, and on the telephone Monisha Rajesh, journalist at The Week magazine and author of Around India in 80 Trains, and special correspondent of tellhacker.com and documentary maker Revati Lal, who joins us from New Delhi. This case is one of many but few to hit the global headlines. Does this mark a dramatic change for India? And what do you expect this death sentence to do? I'd like to come to you first, Revati Lal in New Delhi, as someone there who can tell us how it's resonating.
There's a sort of a schism in both in New Delhi and across the country. To start with, in December last year, soon after reports emerged on how brutal the rape was, there was an outrage which spilled out onto the streets, and there was almost like a never-before-seen activism around a gender issue across the country, not just in Delhi, but in small towns and even in very small towns and villages in central India, in western India, in southern India, where there was an outpouring on the streets about the safety of women and the general misogyny in our midst. But this finally last month convulsed into a clamor for the death penalty for the rapists. Now, alongside this, there was a much smaller but very potent voice, of which I include myself on that side of the spectrum, which said that death penalty by itself is also an act of violence, because death is a violent act if it's meted out as a penalty. And there is a small but significant clamor of people, amongst which are people on gender rights, lawyers, women who have been in situations of violence, and journalists who have reported on this, who say that we have a moral position on this, which says that we are in general against death penalty, and we want the death penalty per se to be abolished. And if exceptions are made, then it tears away at the fabric of the law itself, and it allows the law to be loosened by it being stretched in different directions to accommodate exceptions. Because there are many, many, many brutal acts of violence and crimes against women across the country.
Do you think in New Delhi and in other areas of India that people would have felt their justice had been done if the death penalty wasn't given? Do you think that are those in a minority?
Those are definitely in a minority, but that minority also includes a panel of 3 senior judges who actually wrote the amendment to the rape law, which was taken to the Indian Parliament. Not all of their suggestions were taken on board, and one of the suggestions of this group of judges that was left out was actually this recommendation, that instead of the death penalty, a moral argument against death penalty is perhaps better. There's also a flattening out of how this has got read by the masses, both in the popular media like television and in the newspapers, as well as in all other forums, where people have somehow equated the death penalty with justice. But of course, there are many layers in the middle where death penalty and justice cannot be equated with one another so finely, because there are many shades in the middle. For instance, there are people who, after the death penalty was meted out, there were journalists who went onto the streets and got vox populi from people to say, "Oh well, now we feel safer." Now that, of course, is one extreme. It makes the whole argument for the death penalty seem ridiculous. It's not ridiculous, but it's certainly the merit in that side of the argument has been that people say that our justice system is so skewered, it's slow, it's laborious, it takes long, convicts escape. Therefore, if our jails are not safe, and if also in the case of one of these, there are actually 6 people who were perpetrators in this crime. One hung himself to death in jail. One is a juvenile who has got a juvenile sentencing of 3 years, which is the maximum that a juvenile can be in jail. And the death penalty clamor also has this other side to the argument, which is what happens if these people, their term of sentencing is over. There was a sense that the anger needs closure, that the victim's family want these people to be put to death, and that therefore that should be respected. But none of those arguments are really actually legal arguments, and there is a difference, of course, between what people on the street want and what should be taken on board in a court of law. And my argument is that the two things have their own separate space. That the clamor for justice was important. It got the case fast-tracked. It got a conviction at a rate which is much faster than normal rape cases take in this country. And that's all good. The clamor on the streets for rights of women, the clamor for gender parity, for better rights for women, for safety of women, is all important. But that does not necessarily mean that one has to go to the other end of the spectrum and take on board an argument which says that in order for justice to be done, people need to be killed.
Exactly. I think I'm going to bring in Sunita Ambas from Amnesty International, who, as a human rights organisation, you're asked to comment on cases like this when the death penalty is imposed, and the death penalty is not the answer.
Absolutely. I would start by just completely echoing everything Revati has said about the complete inappropriateness of the death penalty in this situation. And we've consistently, as Amnesty, made 2 distinct points. There has been no evidence anywhere to suggest that it is a particular deterrent to crime, in that it does something more in stopping crime than other forms of punishment don't do. And therefore, the argument in favor of the death penalty, which is usually this is how we can stop these incidents happening in the future, there's almost no empirical basis for that argument, no proof that it actually works. And the second, that Amnesty's position on the death penalty as a matter of principle is that it is the ultimate form of cruel, inhuman, degrading punishment, which is making it contrary to international law, in our opinion. And in the specific context of India, I think the biggest problem with the debate at this point in time is that it's taking away from the series of things that the government really needs to do to make India a safer place for women, because it's impossible for anyone to reasonably believe that just because they are going to hang 1, 2 or 3 rapists, the problem of violence against women in India, which is a deep-rooted, endemic, very complicated problem, is somehow going to be solved by the death penalty. And it's not. What the government needs to be doing is putting in place a range of legal, institutional, procedural changes. And Revati alluded to the commission that had been set up in January to review rape laws in India. And they had come out with a set of fantastic recommendations. And what's the most disappointing thing is that the government did change rape laws in the aftermath of this particular incident. But what they did do was utterly insufficient. There is so much still lacking in the laws. There's so much still lacking in terms of institutional reform. And on the subject of death penalty, another thing that the government did this year when they changed the law was expand the scope of the death penalty. So now you could also be given the death penalty for certain instances of rape, which wasn't the case before this incident. And again, it's an example of how the governmental response has not been to address the underlying causes for violence against women in India, has not been to tackle the truly difficult issues that need to be dealt with, and has been instead to focus on this quick fix solution they think is a solution, which is the death penalty, and it completely isn't.
Monisha Rajesh from The Week magazine and author of Around India in 80 Trains. the death penalty is the quick fix to the endemic problem of violence against women. Where do you see India going, and how much do you think India will need to rely on global feminist movements to get change?
First of all, I'd just like to sort of reflect on what was just said. I absolutely agree that I think what's happened recently is that all the attention has been moved onto the symptoms of what is an enormous problem of gender inequality in India. And the government has managed to shift the focus away from the root cause, which is gender equality, violence against women, a horrible mentality, by simply focusing on how to deal with this particular crime. Because, I mean, once that was in December, and then almost 6 weeks ago, there was another journalist who was gang raped in Mumbai. And then in the same week that was reported, there was a woman in Delhi who was gang raped by 6 people. But there's an enormous hierarchy of rape reporting in India as well. And high-profile cases are given a lot of attention. But every single day, these are happening over and over and over again. And I think what the government did was really to shy away from the main problem by simply saying, right, we're going to hang these people, we're going to hush up the masses, we're going to satisfy an emotional appeal here, which is to feel like they've got justice. But it's not going to make India a safer place for women at all. And what they need to do is start from the grassroots level. They have to start educating people in primary school. They have to start within homes. They need a huge government-backed, very, very strong campaign on television, on radio, everywhere to make sure that this takes place. But I think, genuinely, I actually don't think this is going to happen for a very long time, because you need to also set the standards that you want. And if you actually look at the way the Indian government is structured at the moment, I mean, some of the people who are actually in cabinet currently, in fact, I can quote, 30% of lawmakers have got criminal charges standing against them right now, some of which actually include rape and murder. And just last week, a Reuters report actually revealed that the cabinet has just passed an executive order to protect politicians found guilty of crimes, which means that convicted lawmakers can stay in office and stand in elections. And these are the people that the country is looking to actually fix these problems. So I don't think that they're going to have to rely on so many other people and activists and support from outside India to actually put anything into motion.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare, and I'm joined by writer and broadcaster Badisha, Sunita Ambast from Amnesty International, Manisha Rajesh, journalist at The Week magazine, and special correspondent at telhaka.com, Revati Lul, who joins us from New Delhi. Okay, Badisha, you can reflect on everything that everyone said here, but also, from what Manisha said, it's going to take people in other countries to help get this going at a grassroots level in India.
Well, I want to tackle that because actually I think it's incredibly patronising to say that the rest of the world needs to help India. What people who aren't Indian don't realise is that India has incredible activists, incredibly strong women activists. The reason I quite like being in India, sometimes more than I like being in England, is because of the women's solidarity and the sisterliness that I feel, and that the general lack of dollification. So actually, I love that. I don't think this is a question of the rest of the world looking at India going, God, how terrible. Because believe me, the rate of rape per head of population is the same in India as it is in the UK. So when this rape that happened in Delhi came to light, there were so many articles which really talked about rape as though it's an Indian problem, or it's that something that brown men do. Whereas, of course, this is completely endemic. But I have to say that Manisha's point about the government prompted a wry smile, and I was wondering if it would come up in the conversation because, of course, corruption, political corruption, the fact that you can't necessarily trust the police is an issue. I was actually in India for the top 3 months of this year when all of this reporting was happening, and a few really disturbing things came to light. One was that rape suddenly became a sensationalist issue, almost an entertainment. So papers were competing with themselves to report on the most grotesque attacks on women, on girls, on babies. It was full of it. And then there was all this stirring up of the public desire to kill the perpetrators. I agree with what everyone has said. I think that hanging 3 perpetrators doesn't solve the problem of endemic violence against women at all. It satisfies a very basic desire. But even then, I think it probably satisfies that desire very much in the short term. Because, of course, then you read about the next case, you read about the case after that, and you realise that this is to do with power, which is what rape is. It's an expression of power and an attempt to destroy the victim.
Why do you think this case in particular, though, resonated so much around the world?
Yeah, it did. I think it was something to do with the extreme violence of the attack. It was also to do with the way that the incident itself went against various rape myths that we have. We live in a rape culture in which we blame victims and we let perpetrators go. But this was an upwardly mobile woman, so she was the respectable victim. And I'm not saying this in any kind of good light. I'm not saying that this is how we should interpret this. She was with a male friend. So you couldn't then say, well, who was this woman going out by herself, blah, blah, blah. All of the arguments that rape deniers and rape excusers use fell down here. And the sheer nastiness and perniciousness of the attack, the idea that she and her friend were tricked onto this bus, which looked exactly the same as any other public bus, the details are truly grotesque. She and her friend were tortured. All of her internal reproductive organs ruptured. She lost all but 5% of her intestines, and then they were dumped by the side of the road. And then the grief of the family. But then, as everyone has been saying, there have been cases of equal violence since then, and it's not so much of a news story anymore. I think it's also that Indians ourselves made such a strong protest, and that men and women were involved in the protest. We came out onto the streets because you can now no longer deny this. And actually people believe it. People believe survivors. But then there are all sorts of complications. There are all sorts of class issues. The reports that I saw were often about much lower status women being lured into an office and gang raped by her superiors. I read about kids from slum areas being taken up by a police officer. I know of a family where a young girl was raped by someone in the community. She went to the police officer and they said, oh, either it's not true or you pay us off and this, that and the other. I mean, it was just this legal mess.
I want to just come in here to say a couple of things. There are 2 or 3 strands in this story of the death penalty and of the rape of this girl that somehow still kind of twisted in knots. One of them being the fact that when we report on the ferocity and the viciousness and the violence in this one crime, we somehow do it in a way which separates us, we the media, and us the middle class that's writing about this in general, from the misogyny that surrounds us. But in fact, when we turn the gaze on ourselves, we find that we're embarrassed about, and that's where the kernel of this conversation needs to go. The discussions within India need to go further and deeper into looking at our own culpability in how we, for instance, don't talk to our children about power and sexuality. We don't talk to our children. Now a lot of parents and children have started having conversations about what is a good touch and what is a bad touch. But that's not good enough, because there are no healthy conversations about reclaiming the body for yourself, of being confident of your body, of seeking pleasure in the body and sex as the other corollary of this conversation that needs to happen. But the good thing about it is that the outrage has not died down almost a year later. It's still very much palpable on the streets. There initially was, you could feel on the streets of Delhi, and I live in Delhi and I take public transport a lot. So I could feel that for a short while at least, there was a moving back on a bus or in an auto of men who would normally kind of try and stick to you and feel you up. Those kind of things changed a little bit, and that is a big shift. But there needs to be, the media also needs to look at its own culpability in how it reports on sexuality in general, in other conversations around gender, sexuality, and power.
And that's not just the media in New Delhi. That's the media worldwide.
Yeah, of course, it's the media worldwide. But I'm being specific to India because when we're talking about the death penalty, what's happened is the media is also largely middle class, and they also find it easier to pin the blame on the government, on institutions, and on the police. For instance, a very small story in the newspapers a week ago escaped the notice of a lot of people, which is a policewoman got in the police station, and then there was no reporting of it. It was all hushed up. So there is this clamor amongst the media to say, let's have more women in police stations, but without thinking twice about the fact that that is actually endangering a woman, because often at the level of a police constable, that is often a woman who is herself disempowered, who herself comes from a small ghetto or a slum, who doesn't have the power to take on people in a situation of a heinous crime like this. Then there are also other cases where, which I've reported on, where say a 3-year-old girl was raped by the husband of a principal in a school, and she lives in a slum in Delhi. And this happened around the same time as this Delhi gang rape. And a woman constable threatened her and said, well, are you sure you're telling the truth about this man? If you aren't, then insects will crawl all over your body and you'll get clawed to death by these insects. Now, this is the thing is that these women, so when we ask for women constables, when we ask for the streets to be patrolled more, we have to be careful and calibrated in exactly what we're asking for and what that's going to deliver on the ground. And of course, this is a universal thing. This is not just a Delhi thing or an India thing, but what happens is, in a situation where there is outrage and anger that's boiling over, there is very little space for nuance and for reason, which also needs to be brought in 1 year later.
Manisha, in your article I read, you made recommendations that the government needed to do things at a grassroots level using social media and perhaps using Bollywood film actors to help campaign. And there is a recent It's Your Fault campaign on YouTube that I've watched, and it's got something like 2.5 million views worldwide. What were your ideas behind the way that the government should go forward in terms of addressing this rape culture as opposed to using the death penalty?
I think one of the biggest problems is that as soon as you start saying to people this needs to happen at the grassroots level, the response is, oh, it's going to take forever, oh, it's just not possible, this is such an enormous country. But just one thing I wanted to highlight was that people said a similar thing when it came to the suggestion of eradicating polio in India back in the 80s, and it seemed like trying to empty the sea with a teaspoon. And yet, in the last year, India has been polio-free because they implemented this with such a structured level, and they had activists involved, they had volunteers at every level, they had the government behind it, and they were so rigorous with the way they did it that it was impossible not to see it and not to see what the benefits were going to be. They took it right out into the villages, they educated people. And just another example, when I was researching my book, I visited a hospital train called the Lifeline Express, and they were trying to eradicate diarrhea. And all they did was go one by one to the mother-in-laws of each family and explain to them that by giving water to children, it would hydrate them, not encourage diarrhea, which is what they thought the problem was. And bit by bit, they suddenly found that it actually changed. In the last 10 years, they've actually stopped all the endemic problem. And I think this is what they need to do. Yes, it's going to take a long time, but they need to start in every primary school. They need to start educating boys and girls together. They need to bring people together. And I think they do need to pull in support from people. I mean, the kind of heft that Bollywood actors and cricket stars have in India is enormous. And, you know, you see them on TV and on billboards fronting skin whitening cream adverts instead. And you could put them to such good use. And I think they just need, using social media and using this kind of heft they have, I genuinely feel that they can push this forward.
Sita Ambas, you looked like you wanted to agree with Manisha there and contribute.
Yes, because I completely agree with Manisha in that this is one of those really difficult issues for which there probably isn't a quick fix solution at all, and we need change at all levels. Like, it's the government, it's also within the family, it's within the way we interact with each other as colleagues, in a professional environment. But there are also, I think, certain top-line things that the government should be doing and isn't doing. And that's not to say just because the government passes a certain law, puts in place a certain policy, our problems are going to be solved tomorrow, no. But it is to say that without that happening, it's going to be very difficult to see the change trickle down. And like 2 examples that I really want to give. One is the question of marital rape, which to a large extent in India still isn't criminalized. Now, with the recent amendments, there was a little bit of a change in that position, but I won't go into the technical details. There was a little bit of a change in that position, but to a large extent, marital rape still isn't even recognized as rape. And intimate partner violence or domestic violence is such a high proportion of the sort of violence that women face in India that for this to not see recognition in India's criminal law is a huge step is a huge impediment for women who actually do want to start talking about it. And of course, they're not talking about it right now, but there isn't even the official recognition of that in the law, and that's something that needs to happen. Equally importantly, again, a legal hindrance is the idea of impunity for security forces or armed forces who are engaging in sexual assault. And if it's the army or the police forces who are involved, before they can be prosecuted for any sort of rape in India, they need permission from the central government, which is effectively never given. So you have astonishingly high rates of, how can I put this? Reports that security forces and armed forces have committed heinous acts of sexual violence, and no prosecutions at all for it for many, many years right now, simply because there's been no political will to actually push accountability. And again, the sort of message that gives, the sort of faith that inspires in the state that's supposed to protect women is terrible, because this is one of the reasons why women would not feel comfortable going to a police station. And again, that's not to say if the government makes that change tomorrow, legally, everything is going to be solved. No, it's not. But the fact that this still exists as law in the books is one of the biggest reasons why nothing is actually happening even at the grassroots level.
Badisha is a writer, broadcaster, and human rights campaigner. Where would you like this discussion, not necessarily this discussion here on The Voice of Russia, but the global dialogue that has stemmed from this heinous crime and the death penalty given to the perpetrators, where would you like this to move forward?
I think we're living through extremely interesting times. Part of the reason this one case out of all the millions and billions that happened globally achieved global recognition is because I feel that women all over the world feel the same way. Because you look at the cases in India, you look at the cases in England, you look at cases in Latin America, you look at the Steubenville rapes in Ohio in America, and to me these are all pretty much the same. They are about the prevalence of sexual violence. They're about cultural values which see women as simply being objects to be used, to be violated, to be abused, whether we are a 3-month-old baby or we're an adult woman who's just trying to go from A to B to live our lives. And I think that what's happened is that activists all over the world have connected the dots. So we see the same picture everywhere. We see endemic levels of violence, and there's a scale. So there's sexual harassment, which is verbal. There's sexual assault, which is, it's called groping, but it's sexual assault as far as I'm concerned in public. And then you see it go through to rape and to murder. And we have talked about intimate partner violence, or so-called domestic violence, which is a phrase I absolutely hate because it sort of makes it private and therefore okay. We know that these things are endemic globally. And I think that women all over the world are putting pressure everywhere. So we're putting pressure on the media, we're putting pressure on governments. We are going to absolutely every space possible where we can talk about these things, because I think that we just can't stand it anymore, and we're not going to stand it anymore. Social media is a little bit of a part of that, but actually the world has always been transformed by revolutionary movements, and this is now the next phase in that, because I think it's something that the entire world should be ashamed of.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'd just like to thank all my guests for joining me on The Voice of Russia. Manisha Rajesh, journalist at The Week magazine, author of Around India in 80 Trains, special correspondent at telhacker.com, and documentary maker Revati Lul, and Badisha, writer and broadcaster, and Sanita Ambast, India campaigner with Amnesty International.